In today's highly requested video, we have an amazing 21 oil pastel techniques and tips. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Michelle and I teach all things watercolor, drawing, watercolor pencils, lots of mixed media too. If that's the sort of thing you're interested in, please do consider subscribing. Did you know that modern fine art oil pastels have only been around since 1947? They did exist in a different format before then, but they were not quite as good. They were used mostly in art schools, particularly in Japan. But in 1947, Picasso approached Henri Sennelier. I believe he was having trouble sourcing oil pastels because of the war, and he begged him to create an artist's version of fine art oil pastel that could be used on pretty much any surface that was full of pigment. And today we have lots of brands available. They're very cost effective, they're very versatile. And for our first tip today, we're going to look at the surfaces you can use them on. Now, as we mentioned at the beginning, oil pastels are hugely versatile. They can go on anything from wood to canvas to paper to glass. But as a beginner, you'll most likely be using paper. Your paper does not need to be stretched unless you are using them mixed media, which we'll talk about later in the video. I've got some very different paper examples here. Here I've got some fairly smooth card. So of course you can use card or sketch pad paper. I've got some mixed media paper here. I'll bring these back in a moment so you can see the comparison. I've got some coloured pastel paper here. This is a great option, especially as a beginner, because you don't have to apply as much. That background colour is always going to be there for you. Pastel papers come in a huge variety of surfaces and textures. You can even get velour ones, although I do find they are a little bit difficult for oil pastels. Here I've got some canvas paper, so we can use canvas paper, canvas board, or canvas itself. Stretched canvas will be a little bit more tricky because it has so much give in it. Finally, I've got some watercolor paper here. Now, what you will notice is that with a smoother surface, you get a more even application. The rougher the surface, the more dotted and gappy your application is going to be. That's not always a bad thing. And we're going to look at blending techniques as we go through the video. Any of these papers and surfaces and many more are suitable for your oil pastels. So in this video, we're going to work our way through application techniques, blending techniques, mediums and tools that you can use, and we're going to finish up with some fantastic and really interesting mixed media techniques, because using oil pastels with watercolor is one of my favorite ways to use them. So let's start right from the beginning at how you basically apply them to paper. So let's start with the underdrawing. What you don't want to do, and this goes for most dry media, is you don't want to start your underdrawing with graphite pencil. Once you've got oil pastel on the paper, an eraser is going to do you no good whatsoever. You're not going to be able to shift this. It's going to be very noticeable at the end. Instead, you should use an oil pastel that is very similar in colour to your paper, but just shows up enough to give you a guideline. If you're working on white paper, you can either use something like a light grey or a light beige, or you can choose something that matches with the colour of your subject, for example, green if you're doing leaves. Let's look at applying oil pastel lightly. You'll get a gappy surface where the pastel hits the top of the bumps on the paper. To give a light textured application like this, if you want to cover a big area, using the pastel on its side can be helpful. You may find if working on a wooden board like me, it actually picks up the texture of the surface underneath. That may be something you want. If it's not, then you'll want to place some more paper underneath to smooth that surface. If I press harder with my pastel and go over areas again and again, I can get a much more blocky effect. With a textured surface, some of the blending techniques we're going to use in this video may be necessary to fill in those little gaps. Do remember that once you've gone as dark as this, it can be hard to go on top with a different colour, simply because all of the grain in the paper has been filled in, creating a smooth surface which will be much harder to adhere further colours to. But if you want that fully blocked in effect, this is how you do it. Let's look at what happens when we blend various colours together. So we're going to apply quite thickly, going to slightly thinner. Here I'll use some black on the other side, and again going to slightly thinner as the colours come together. I'm going to use my fingers here, but I'll show you some better blending methods later, because actually oil pastels are quite tough to blend and you can over a large area end up with blisters. You can see how the black has dulled the orange. Now let's try white. This is actually an iridescent white because when teaching classes a year or two ago, somebody went off with my white, so I need to order some more. You can see we're getting a lighter creamy colour appearing here. We can blend with grey, using my left hand now because honestly I'm running out of clean fingers. And we start to mute our colour, but not quite as violently as when we use the black. We can use another bright warm colour. This will keep both colours vibrant, but you will of course get some crossover. We can also use opposite colours. I'll swap to a red here because red and green are opposites. We can use opposite colours and they will mute each other. So you see here with the colour opposites we get muting. With related bright colours we just get vibrancy. Now what do you do if you want to apply your pastel lightly like this? You want to blend it and you don't want to add white and get sort of a pastel effect. And yet it may not blend that well when applied like this in such a gappy manner. Many oil pastel sets include a clear pastel. If you don't have one, you could use some household candle wax. I'm going to apply this to the area first. This will mean that when I blend, I'll get a much smoother result. Another method that works really well with oil pastels is Pointillism. This is where artists apply different sections of colour in order that the eyes visually mix them together. For example, if I apply enough of these pink and blue dots, when viewed from a distance, you will start to see them as lilac. When working on coloured paper like this, the background paper colour will also have an effect. For lighter, brighter colours, you can do this on white paper too. Let's look at a technique called Scraffito. What we're going to do is apply a light colour all over to an area of our picture. Then we're going to take a darker colour over the top. You can mix more than one colour in if you want to. Now we can use a Scraffito effect to push through to the underneath layer. I'm using a palette knife here, which gives quite a broad stroke. Or you could use something like an embossing tool or any hard dull point that won't cut your paper. And you can use your pastels almost like a scraper board. You don't actually have to set this up in advance. If you're doing something like a landscape and you've got multiple layers of multiple colours, it's really easy to go in with a hard point, scratch out some grasses or some texture on fur. This is a really fantastic technique. At this point in the video, if you're getting some value from this free tutorial, could I ask for a quick favour? Could you please click that thumbs up, that like button for me? If you like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment. It'll take you no time at all and zero money, but it really helps the channel. And that helps me to be able to keep making free tutorials such as this one. Whilst we've got our palette knife out, we can actually do a technique called Impasto, which is often used by oil painters where they build up thick layers of paint so it almost looks 3D. And we can use our palette knife, I think I've got a bit of black on mine, to mix up some pastel that we can apply to our painting. You can see that sometimes it looks a little dry. I'm going to get a tiny drop of baby oil and this will help to soften and moisten the pastel. I can then start to apply it just like an oil painter, working in various colours, building up that impasto technique. Be careful not to use too much oil. I did see someone recommending to mix hand cream in. I would go for baby oil or pure vegetable oils because you don't know what's in various types of hand cream. I would also only use this in small areas simply because it's not very cost effective. You're going to get through a lot of pastel. If you're looking to use an impasto effect over your whole painting, you probably are better off using oils or acrylics. You might be wondering at this point, is it actually possible to apply these more neatly and get sharper edges? It certainly is. I'm going to share a few techniques for you now that are going to get you sharper edges. Now, the first idea I've got for you for getting sharper edges with your oil pastels is to actually use some coloured pencils. So in this case, you'll apply your oil pastel first. Now, coloured pencil won't work exactly on top of oil pastel, so you can use it almost to push the pastel around. But because there's some pigment in it, where it hits paper that doesn't have oil pastel on, it'll also pop some pigment on that edge. So we can use this to manipulate and just sharpen up those edges a little bit. It will also, of course, blend slightly. You can use it almost like a blending tool. We'll have more of those in a moment. But you can see you can get a much sharper edge. See how it's picking up some of the oil pastel as it pushes it aside? Don't worry about that. You can see we can use this coloured pencil to sharpen our edge. If you only have watercolor pencils, you could give those a go as well. The next way I have of sharpening an edge is just to use a piece of card. Now here I'm going to use it to help me keep a straight edge. But of course it could be much more complicated than this. You could cut it into a curve, for example. You could use stencil card and make actual shapes. One of the simplest ways to sharpen edges is simply to put a block in the way by way of a little piece of card. Make sure it's fairly stiff. Flimsy paper won't work quite as well. The final way I have of sharpening an edge, and this will also make narrow lines, is to use some tape. Now this is masking tape. You can see it's got fluff on it. I've stuck it to my jumper because I want to reduce the amount of sticky on it. You can also try various other low tack painter's tapes, including Scotch tape, but you always want to try this out before putting it on a painting. The thinner your paper is, the more likely it is to tear. All we're going to do there is work in between. Then I'm going to remove the tape. Whenever you pull tape off, keep it at a low angle, pull it slowly. Not only can we get a straight edge this way, but we can also make extremely fine lines, great for pastel work and of course mixed media. Now moving on from basic application, we're going to look at blending tools and blending mediums. Now what you need to understand about this section is they're all interchangeable. So if I show one blending tool with any particular blending medium, that blending medium could be used with any tool and that blending tool could be used with any medium. So everything in this section is interchangeable, but I've designed it in order to show you as many different blending tools and as many different mediums as I can. Of course, more tools and more mediums may exist, but these are the most commonly available ones. So let's get started. Now we've discussed how too much blending with fingers can cause blisters. So we're going to use some blending tools. The first and simplest one is just what we in the UK call kitchen paper, what everybody else would call paper towel. And you're just going to sort of fold it 2 or 3 times and then wrap it around your finger. And we can just use this to blend with. As with any blending between separate colours, you want to think about what you're doing. You don't want to take this, for example, and stick it straight on the red here unless you want to dull it down. So you'll want to, reposition now and again so that you keep the colours fairly clean and don't muddy up any colours that you're trying to keep sparkly clean. So this is the easiest thing to grab when you're blending. Next up, I have a paper stump, or tortillon, I think they call them in French. Now, this one is certainly more effective. Do you see how it's pushing the oil pastel into all the little bumps in the paper? So we're getting a much smoother blend than we did when we were working with the kitchen paper. And we can also blend between colours. It doesn't spread colours quite as far either. You can clean it up just with a little bit of sandpaper if you need to. Now I have a silicone tool. So these can be bought for crafts. You can also buy them for nail art. The one I've got is probably not the best shape for this actually. A bit of a broader tip would stand up to this sort of thing a little better. It's not as firm as the paper stump. You can experiment if you don't have any art ones or any nail ones. You can experiment if you've got some small silicone spatulas in the kitchen. Obviously wash them well before you use them for food, but this is another option for blending. Next up, we're going to have a look at some mediums you can put on your paper. I've got some baby oil here and some cotton wool. Now, there was some confusion amongst the Americans about what cotton wool is. It's just what we call it in the UK. It does not have any wool in. We just call it that, maybe because it looks like wool and it's fluffy. I don't know, makes no sense, does it? So you're going to get a little bit of this, and you can use other types of vegetable oils as well, and you're going to blend. Now, you want to be careful not to use too much. It does change the colour of the pastel. It also can sink into the paper. So it is better used with heavier supports like canvas board, but certainly you can use various oils. And they do quite a good job of blending, but as I said, there is a definite chance that things get a bit murky if you're not careful. Again, you'll need to move around to clean parts. Never pour the oil directly on your paper either. You want to put it onto the thing you're applying it with and use it very sparingly. You probably can't see it, but I've got some white spirit in here. So you can use things like terps and other mediums that are used for oil painting. And we can use this to blend. To be honest, it more dissolves than blends. It can lift and push the oil pastel around. Again, it's something I would prefer to use when I'm working on a very strong support. Something that would work better than this is a medium. I think it's called Gamsol. It's basically a spirit for oil painting and other artistic mediums that has low odor. Now, I want you to only do things like this if you're in an area that's well ventilated. I have a background in printmaking, and I know that these chemicals can be really, really dangerous. Never eat or drink when you're using them. And if you have any issues whatsoever with your lungs, I would just stay away from them altogether. Now on to my favourite medium. Now, oil pastels, being oil-based, do of course resist watercolour. This can lead to some really interesting mixed media effects. Now, to be clear, there are probably dozens, maybe even hundreds of ways that you can use oil pastel as mixed media. I'm hoping this coming year on YouTube to have a lot more mixed media stuff for you. But here I'm going to share initially some watercolour and oil pastel combinations, because really these are some of the most interesting and stunning ways to use oil pastels, and personally they are my favourite. One of the ways I use oil pastel most often is with watercolour paints. So what will happen is you apply the oil pastel lightly like this. It'll skip across, leaving little gaps, and then you can apply your watercolour paint on top. Now, it's really important that you use a very old brush when doing this, because the brush may well pick up some of the oil pastel. Of course, there are various things you can use for getting oil out of brushes, but if you do this with your top quality, best watercolour brushes, they're never really going to be the same again. So use an old brush for this technique. It can create sparkle on water, particularly at sunsets. I also used it in a recent tutorial to get rocky details on a snow scene. It's a very versatile technique. I've got several tutorials using this method on my channel. I'll link to one of them at the end of this video, so make sure you keep watching. Here's a swatch of paint that I was using in one of my recent videos. It's completely dry, but I can always add oil pastel on top because oil pastel is completely opaque. Therefore, this might just be the solution. If you have, for example, forgotten to reserve something light on your paper, you can easily go on top with oil pastel. Be aware that, like any mixed media, it is going to show, it's going to be noticeable. So what I like to do is use it in more than one place on a particular painting. If you just do this in one small area, it's going to be very noticeable. It's going to be looking a little bit out of place, perhaps. So if you find yourself needing to go into mixed media, do it with confidence, do it in more than one place on your painting, and then everybody will think you did it on purpose. Let's do some mixed media monoprinting. So I've got a very thin sheet of printer paper here. It doesn't matter what sort of paper you use, make sure it's thin. You'll find out why in a moment. I've also got a piece of watercolour paper. Obviously on a larger painting, I'd be working on stretched paper. What you're going to do now is turn your paper over and you want to tape it down. I've also got an embossing point. If you don't have one of these, a ballpoint pen, especially one that's run out of ink, will do the job nicely. I'm going to take this photograph now and I'm going to start, let's position it in the middle, and I'm just going to start tracing this design through. It's a good idea to tape the edge of the photograph down as well. I think I'll do that before I carry on. This will stop it from moving around, and if you need to, you can lift it up and see how your tracing is going, just to make sure it's working. So we're going to lift up the top layer, we're going to lift up the second layer, and look what we've got here. We're getting this beautiful effect in multiple colours. Let's carry on. I'm going to stop there, but we could easily continue. What we've got now is we've got a traced outline in oil pastel, but we're not done yet. Now I can work on top using my colours, and I can get a really beautiful result. Remember not to go so dark or strong with your paints that you can't see the oil pastel anymore. Do let me know if you'd like a full tutorial using this method on my channel. I promised you 21 tips and techniques. We've only had 20 so far. My last tip is going to be all about how to store and keep your pastels clean. So I thought I'd show you how I store my oil pastels. The ones I've been using today are mostly Van Gogh pastels by Talons, and you can see I store them by colour. Of course, you're welcome to store your pastels in the original box, but if you've got lots of different brands, it's always a good idea to store by colour. Storing different brands by brand really doesn't give you the chance to look and say you need an orange, and then you can go here and you can see all of the oranges that you've got, and it gives you the opportunity to pick the one you need. Will also help you to see what's missing. Perhaps you need a purple and you haven't got quite the right shade. You can usually order them individually. Now these are rather mucky. I've been dragging them around various art classes for years, back when I was teaching full-time. Now you can clean them up just by rubbing them on some sketch paper, but actually using something like kitchen paper can be a bit more effective. This one's especially mucky. Remember, you only need to clean the actual surface of the part you're going to be using so that you've got a nice clean area to work with. So do let me know if you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like some full oil pastel tutorials, some full mixed media oil pastel tutorials, you can see what a versatile medium it is. Now, some of you are going to ask me in the comments how you seal and look after oil pastels. That really is a much bigger subject. If you're a complete beginner, I wouldn't even worry about it. But there are a few long-term concerns with the conservation of oil pastels. I'm talking decades, not months. But if you want to use them for something fine art like that, it is worth investigating so that you can preserve them for as long as possible. Now, before you leave this video, don't forget to pop into the video description. I've got lots of free stuff down there for you. I've got some free downloadables, got some free courses for you. And if you enjoyed this video, you might like my mixed media tutorial. It's part of my winter landscape challenge, which you can take at any time, even in the summer. I'll put that video up for you to watch right now.